During last month's government shutdown, Americans observed a stark example of political dysfunction. The government was on the brink of disaster, hanging on a ledge as it neared closer and closer to defaulting on its trillions of dollars worth of debt. It's the default that economists argue would have triggered an economic collapse and reinvigorated a global financial meltdown. Despite the fact that the system was salvaged in the 11th hour, analysts argue that the event serves as yet another reminder that the country is on the brink of another crisis. That impending doom is the topic of a new book called The Crash of 2016, The Plot to Destroy America and What We Can Do to Stop It. It was written by RT's very own Thom Hartmann. And earlier last night, I had a chance to speak with Thom, who walked me through some of the recent events that he says are a recipe for economic disaster.
I think the government shutdown is a symptom of this rise of the royalist class that I talk about in the book, using the old phrase that FDR did to describe the billionaires, and not only they're attempting to seize total economic dominion power, but also political power. Really, the crash started back in 2006, and when the housing market started to fall apart, just like the great crash in 1929 started in 1927 when the housing market fell apart. And we are still in it. In 2009, we were losing 700,000 jobs a month when Obama was sworn in that month, and he didn't stop the crash. What he did was he basically jammed enough bubble gum and baling wire against it to just hold it, which is why we're still in this very, very painful phase. It's interesting that in the 1930s, they didn't refer to it as the Great Depression. That phrase didn't come about until the 1940s. I think, a decade from now, 2 decades from now, we're going to be referring to this as the Great Depression of 2000, roughly the 2010, 2015, 2016.
So what does a recession in 2016 look like? What kind of symptoms can we see?
I think we saw a glimpse of it in 2008 when the market fell almost in half. I would expect that it's going to be that and worse. And you're going to see, more massive unemployment, a large drop in the stock market. The risky part, if you look at these crashes, about every 80 years these things happen. 80 years ago was the Great Depression, 80 years before that the Civil War, 84 years before that the American Revolution. The economic crashes are always followed by wars. So the question that we have to face now, and this is something, a very serious consideration, is, will this be followed by a war? The good news, I think, is that Americans are so war-weary because of Bush lying us into 2 wars that, we said basically no when President Obama wanted to have war in Syria. But on the other hand, there are things that might be out of our control. I mean, if Saudi Arabia and Iran decided to go to war, I mean, something like that, or if China and Taiwan, I mean, who knows? There are so many things that could suck us in.
And a lot of people argue throughout history that war has been used to boost economies throughout time. So what you're saying is possibly that the war could be used to help get us out of whatever crash or recession comes?
Well, that's sort of what happened in World War II. Wars are massive government spending programs, and the most efficient way to get out of a great crash is to have a massive government spending program. It's tragic that World War II was the thing that pushed spending up to the point where we really finally popped out of the Great Depression. Roosevelt got us 3/4 of the way there, though, with other, with WPA and CCC and things like that. Let's hope that it's not war that gets us out this time.
So is there anything that we can do to reverse the trend that we seem to be on leading up to this 2016 or whenever it happens to be crash?
Yeah. First of all, it could happen at any time. I'm projecting 2016 because the Obama administration is doing the same thing the Bush administration did, which is try to hold it off until after the elections in November of, in that case, 2008, in this case, 2016. I don't know if they'll be successful or not. I'm frankly skeptical. What can we do? The fundamentals have to be changed. We need to break up the big banks. We need to start enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act, and not just the big banks, but virtually every industry in America has been totally verticalized and is in the hands of 2 or 3 or 4 corporations. That in nature, broad and diverse is strong. top-heavy and very narrow is fragile, and every aspect of our economy now is like that and fragile, from banking to ag to, I mean, fill in the blanks. So we've got to start enforcing the Sherman Act, bring back something like Glass-Steagall. We've got to bring back the middle class. We've got to change our insane trade policies, and these are things, and that's just the beginning. But basically, it's roll back the Reagan tax cuts. It's largely rolling back the Reagan Revolution. If we could successfully roll back the Reagan Revolution, we could stop this thing in its tracks. But the political will's not there. The political will for these kinds of really big changes only comes about with crashes.
So where do we put the blame? Does the blame solely lie on the heads of these big banks, these corporations and whatnot? Or does the blame go back to Congress, back to you, and back to me?
Blame is an interesting word, because this is the result of our forgetting what we once knew as America. You know, America knew how to get out of a depression. We've done it 3 times, arguably. Actually, we've done it 5 or 6 times with minor depressions, and we forget the lessons. Arnold Toynbee is said to have said that when the last man who remembers the horrors of the last Great War dies, the next Great War becomes inevitable. The generation that remembered the mistakes we made in the 1920s, Harding coming into office in 1920 and dropping the top income tax rate from 91% down to 25%, all that stuff, that generation has died, or is dying. And those lessons have been forgotten, and we're making the same mistakes that we made in the 20s. So that's really where the blame is. The corruptors and the greed heads, you know, they're always there, but we're allowing them to take over again, just like we did in the 1920s.
And some of the stories that you kind of highlighted in your book were these tragic cases where people lost everything. So will it take another generation of people losing everything to really wake up the country and have those changes that you're talking about that need to happen?
Yeah, we're already halfway into a lost generation, the people who are coming of age right now and have been for the last 6 or 7 years, the people who are in their late teens through their mid-20s, you know, and are so in debt that it's going to take them a decade or 2 just to get out of debt. Much less start a family, start building equity by buying a home, the kinds of things that people historically did. So we are already into that lost generation, and that's the kind of hope, is that the next bubble that bursts will be the student debt bubble, that the young people in America are going to wake up and say, you know, to hell with this, we've had enough, and that could be actually a very positive way that would possibly provoke the crash, but could also provoke an appropriate response to it.
And finally, Thom, you've talked about some ways to fix this, but given the society that we have built, given the government that we have voted in, how viable is it to actually happen?
I don't think that any of these major structural changes are, I mean, many of them have been proposed. Right? Nancy Pelosi actually got a number of these things out of the House of Representatives, only to be filibustered by Republicans in the Senate. The Senate has proposed some of these things, only to be blocked now in the House. So I don't think we're going to see the necessary political and economic changes happen until there's just an overwhelming national consensus, and that's going to be the consequence of the crash.
Thank you so much.
That's the good news, actually, of the crash.
The good news of the crash, if there can be some light at the end of the tunnel there. Thom Hartmann is the host of The Big Picture and author of the new book, The Crash of 2016. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Megan.